Hi guys. So today I'm going to be reading The Secret of the Old Clock, which is the Nancy Drew book number 1, and we're going to go to chapter 4. So chapter 3, I'll just read the last little bit there. Then the Tophams fall heir to the entire estate, Mr. Drew commented. Yes, unless a more recent will is uncovered. Another will? Carson Drew inquired innocently. Then you believe Crowley made a second one? Mr. Rolstead hesitated, as though uncertain whether or not he should divulge any further information. Then, with a quick glance about, he lowered his voice and said, "Of course, this is strictly confidential." So that's where we left off on chapter 3. Now we're at chapter 4, Racing the Storm. Confidential? Mr. Drew repeated, looking at Mr. Rolstead. You may rest assured that whatever you tell us will not be repeated to anyone. Well, I'll say this much, Mr. Rolstead went on. About a year ago, Josiah Crowley came to me and said he wanted to draw up a new will. He indicated that he intended to spread out his bequests among several people. He expressed a desire to write the will himself and asked me a number of questions. I took him to my office and told him exactly how to proceed. When he left, he promised to have me look over the document after he had drawn it up. Then you actually saw the will? Mr. Drew asked in surprise. No. Strange to say, Crowley never came back. I don't know whether he ever wrote the will or not. And if he did, there would be a chance that it would not be legal? Nancy spoke up. Yes. He might have typed it and signed the paper without a witness. In this state, at least 2 witnesses are required, and 3 are advisable. What would happen, Nancy asked, if a person were ill or dying and had no witness, and wanted to make a will? Mr. Rolstead smiled. That sometimes happens. If the person writes the will himself by hand and signs it, so there's no doubt the same person did both, the surrogate's office will accept it for probate. Then, if Mr. Crowley wrote out and signed a new will, it would be legal, Nancy commented. That's right. But there's another thing to remember. It's pretty risky for someone who's not a lawyer to draw up a will that cannot be broken. Mr. Drew nodded. If Josiah Crowley left any loophole in a will he wrote personally, the Tophams would drag the matter into court. Yes, it's a foregone conclusion that the Tophams will fight to keep the fortune whether they have a right to it or not. I believe some other relatives have filed a claim, but up to the moment they have no proof that a later will exists. Although Nancy gave no indication of her feelings, the possibility that Mr. Crowley had made a new will thrilled her. As soon as Mr. Drew paid the luncheon check, the 3 arose and left the dining room. Mr. Rolstead took leave of Nancy and her father in the lobby. Well, Nancy, did you find out what you wanted to know? Mr. Drew asked after the lawyer had left. Oh, Dad, it's just as I suspected. I'm sure Mr. Crowley did make a later will. He hid it someplace, if only I could find out where. It would be like looking for a needle in a haystack, Mr. Drew commented. I must figure out a way, Nancy said with determination. I want to help little Judy. She awoke the next morning thinking about the mystery, but where should she start hunting for possible clues to a second will? She continued pondering about it while she showered and dressed. As she entered the dining room, she was greeted with a cheery "Good morning" from her father and Hannah Gruen. During breakfast, Mr. Drew said, Nancy, would you do a little errand for me this morning? Why, of course, Dad. I have a number of legal documents which must be delivered to Judge Hart at Masonville sometime before noon. I take them there myself, but I have several important appointments. I'd appreciate it if you would drive over there with them. I'll be glad to go, Nancy promised willingly. Besides, it's such a wonderful day, I'll enjoy the trip. Where are the papers? At the office. You can drive me down and I'll get them for you. Nancy, wearing a yellow sunback dress and jacket, hurried away to get her gloves and handbag. Before Mr. Drew had collected his own belongings, she had brought her car from the garage and was waiting for him at the front door. I put the top down so I can enjoy the sun, she explained as her father climbed in. Good idea. I heard you haven't mentioned the Crowley case yet today, Mr. Drew teased as they rode along. Have you forgotten about them?" Nancy's face clouded. "No, I haven't forgotten, but I must admit I am stumped as to where to search for clues." "Maybe I can help you. I have learned that the two girls on River Road who expected to be remembered in the will are named Hoover. You might look them up on your return trip." "That's great. I'll watch the mailboxes for their name." When they reached the building where Mr. Drew had his office, Nancy parked the car and waited while her father went upstairs to get the legal documents to be delivered to Judge Hart. Returning a few minutes later, he placed a fat manila envelope in his daughter's hand. "Give this to the judge. You know where to find him?" "Yes, Dad, in the old Merchants Trust Company building." "That's right." Selecting a recently constructed highway, Nancy rode along, glancing occasionally at the neatly planted fields on either side. Beyond were rolling hills. "Pretty," she commented to herself. "Oh, why can't all people be nice like this scenery and not make trouble?" It was nearly 11 o'clock when she finally drove into Masonville. Nancy went at once to Judge Hart's office, but was informed that he had gone to the courthouse. Recalling that her father had mentioned the necessity of the papers being delivered before noon, she set off in search of the judge. Nancy had considerable trouble trying to see him, and it was 12 o'clock when at last she delivered the manila envelope into his hands. "Thank you very much," he said. "I'll need these directly after lunch." Nancy smiled. "Then I'm glad I found you." When Judge Hart learned that Nancy was the daughter of Carson Drew, he at once insisted that she have luncheon with him and his wife at their home before returning to River Heights. She accepted the invitation and spent a very pleasant hour with the Harts. During the meal, the judge laughingly asked if Nancy was still playing egg to her father. "Oh, yes," she said, and at once told him about the Drews' interest in the Crowley case. "Did you know Josiah Crowley or ever hear of him?" she asked. Both the Harts nodded. "A maid who used to be with them came to work for us after Mrs. Crowley's death," the judge explained. "Jane herself passed away a short time ago." "We never met Josiah," Mrs. Hart added, "but Jane pointed him out to my husband and me one time down on Main Street." "Did he have any friends or relatives in town?" Nancy inquired. "I think not," the judge replied. Nancy wondered what old Josiah had been doing in Masonville, if he had had no relatives or friends there. The town was not known as a spot for sightseeing. Her interest was further quickened when Mrs. Hart remarked that she had seen Mr. Crowley in town at another time also. "How long ago was that?" the girl asked. Mrs. Hart thought for a minute, then replied, "Oh, less than a year, I'd say." When luncheon was over, the judge said he must leave. Nancy told the Harts that she too must go. She thanked them for their hospitality and then said goodbye. Soon she was driving homeward. Why had Mr. Crowley gone to Masonville? She asked herself. Could it have had anything to do with a later will? Nancy had chosen a route which would take her to River Road. Half an hour later she turned into the beautiful country road which wound in and out along the Muskoka River, and began to look at the names on the mailboxes. Hoover, she reminded herself. About halfway to River Heights, while enjoying the pastoral scenes of cows standing knee-high in shallow sections of the stream and sheep grazing on flower-dotted hillsides, Nancy suddenly realized the sun had been blotted out. "Oh, a thunderstorm's on the way," she told herself, glancing at the black clouds scudding along the sky. "Guess I'd better put the top of the car up." She pressed the button on the dashboard to raise the top, but nothing happened. Puzzled, Nancy tried again. Still there was no response. By this time large drops of rain had started to fall. "I'll get soaked," Nancy thought as she looked around. There was no shelter in sight, but ahead, past the steep rise, was a sharp bend in the road. Hopeful that there would be a house or barn beyond, Nancy started the car again. Vivid forked lightning streaked across the sky. It was followed by an earth-shaking clap of thunder. The rain came down harder. "Oh, why didn't I bring a raincoat?" Nancy wailed. When Nancy swung around the bend, she was delighted to see a barn with lightning rods about a quarter-mile ahead. Farther on stood a small white house. "I wonder if that's the Hoover place," Nancy mused. By now the storm was letting loose in all its fury. The sky was as dark as night, and Nancy had to switch on her headlights to see the road. She was already thoroughly drenched, and her thought of shelter at this point was one of safety rather than of keeping dry. Nancy turned on the windshield wipers, but the rain was so blinding in its intensity, and it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Almost in an instant the road had dissolved into a sea of mud. Nancy had been caught in a number of storms, but never one as violent as this. She feared a bad skid might land her in a ditch before she could reach the shelter of the barn. How much farther is it? She worried. It didn't seem this far away. The next instant, to Nancy's right, a ball of fire rocketed down from the sky. Oh, that was close, she thought fearfully. Her skin tingled with the electrical vibrations in the air. A moment later, a surge of relief swept over Nancy. At last, she breathed. At the side of the road, the barn loomed up. Its large double doors were wide open. Without hesitation, Nancy headed straight for the building and drove in. The next moment, she heard a piercing scream. Chapter 5. A Surprising Story. Nancy froze behind the wheel. Had she inadvertently hit someone? Her heart pounding in fright, she opened the car door to step out. At the same instant, a shadowy figure arose from a pile of hay near her. I guess I must have scared you silly when I screamed, said a girl of Nancy's age, stepping forward. You're all right? Nancy gasped. Yes, and I'm sorry I yelled. I came out here to check on our supply of feed for the chickens. I didn't think it was going to be a bad storm, so I didn't bother to go back into the house. It's pretty bad, said Nancy. Well, the storm terrified me, the girl continued. I didn't hear your car coming, and when it rushed in here, I panicked. Nancy began to breathe normally again, and then told the stranger her name and the fact the mechanism for raising the top of the convertible was not working. That's a shame, said the girl, and you must get your clothes dried. The storm is letting up. Let's dash over to the house. Grace will help you too. She's my sister. My name's Allison Hoover. Hoover! Nancy was tempted to tell Alice that she had been planning to call, but she decided not to mention it at the moment. It might be better to do her sleuthing more subtly. Nancy smiled at Allison. Thanks a million, but first I'd like to wipe out the car. Are there any rags around in the barn? Allison produced several, and together the two girls mopped the water from the cushions and floor. By this time the rain had stopped. As Nancy and Allison sloshed through a series of puddles to the farmhouse, Nancy had a better chance to study her companion. She was tall, with reddish blonde hair and very fair skin. Her voice was musical, and she had an attractive, lilting laugh. The girls reached the run-down farmhouse and stamped the mud from their shoes on the back porch. Then Allison flung open the door, and they entered a cheerful kitchen. As the door shut behind them, another girl, who was just closing the oven of an old-fashioned range, turned toward them in surprise. Grace, I've brought a visitor, Allison said quickly. Nancy, I want you to meet my sister. She's the mainstay of our family of two. Grace Hoover cordially acknowledged the introduction and greeted Nancy with a warm smile. Nancy judged her to be at least 4 years older than Allison. Her face was rather serious, and it was evident from her manner that responsibility had fallen on her shoulders at an early age. Nancy was attracted to both girls, and responded to their friendly welcome. She put on a robe which Allison brought her, and Grace hung her wet clothes near the range. Presently, Grace pulled an ironing board from a closet with the intention of pressing Nancy's garments. But Nancy would not hear of this, and she began to iron them herself. This is fun, she said to the sisters. I don't know what I would have done without you girls. Oh, it's great for us, Allison spoke up. We don't have much company. To tell you the truth, we can't afford it. Grace stepped to the stove, removed a golden brown cake from the oven, and set it on the table to cool. But today, we are not talking about money. It's Allison's birthday, and this is a birthday cake. Nancy, if you're not in too much of a hurry, I wish you'd join us in a little celebration. Why, I'd love to, Nancy said. Grace's cakes are yummy, Allison declared. I'm not much of a cook myself. My department is taking care of the barn and the chickens. Soon Nancy finished pressing her clothes and put them back on. Meanwhile, the cake had cooled, and Grace started to spread the chocolate frosting. Suppose you two go into the living room and wait, she suggested. I'll bring in the cake and tea. Nancy followed Allison to the adjoining room. Although it was comfortable, the room did not contain much furniture. The floor had been painted and was scantily covered with handmade rag rugs. with the exception of an old-fashioned sofa, an inexpensive table, and a few straight-backed chairs, and an old oil stove which furnished heat in cold weather. There was little else in the room. However, dainty white curtains covered the windows, and Nancy realized that although the Hoovers were poor, they had tried hard to make their home attractive. "Do you girls live here alone all the time?" Nancy inquired. Allison nodded. "Grace and I have been living here since Father died. That was 2 years ago. Mother passed away just before that," the girl added with a slight catch in her voice. Their illnesses took every penny we had." "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," Nancy remarked sympathetically. "It must be dreadfully hard for two girls to run the farm by themselves." "Our farm isn't as large as it once was," Allison said quietly. "We have only a few acres left. I know you are too polite to ask how we manage, Nancy. Grace helps a dressmaker in Masonville whenever she can get work. She makes all her own clothes, and mine, too. And I raise chickens." From just beyond the doorway suddenly came the strains of "Happy Birthday to You, Happy Birthday." By this time Nancy had joined in. She and Grace finished. "Birthday to you, happy birthday, dear Allison, happy birthday to you." Grace set the cake with 18 lighted candles on the table. She and Nancy sang the second verse with the words, "May you have many more." Tears stood in Allison's eyes. When the song ended, she grasped her sister in a tremendous hug. Then she gave Nancy one. This is the nicest birthday I've had in years," she quavered. "And it's one of the most enjoyable I've ever attended," Nancy said sincerely. Suddenly Allison began to sing a tuneful old English ballad about the birthday of a village lass. Nancy listened, entranced, to Allison's clear, bell-like tones. When she finished, Allison applauded, then said, "Oh, that was perfectly lovely! You have a beautiful voice, Allison." The singer laughed gaily. "Thank you, Nancy. I've always wanted to take lessons, but as you know, voice training is pretty expensive." At that moment, Grace brought in a tray of fragrant tea. As she poured 3 cups, Allison blew out the candles and served the cake. "I have never tasted anything more delicious in all my life," Nancy said enthusiastically. The 3 girls chatted like old friends. Finally, the sun broke through the clouds. As Nancy rose to leave, she noticed an unusual picture on the wall opposite her and commented on its beauty. "Uncle Josiah Crowley gave it to us," Allison told her. "If he were only alive now, things would be very different." At the mention of the name, Nancy sat down again. Was she going to pick up a clue to the possibility that Mr. Crowley had made a later will? "He wasn't really our uncle," Grace explained, "but we loved him as much as though he were a relative." Her voice broke, and for a moment she could not go on. Then, gaining control of herself, she continued, "He lived on the farm next to us. That was when Mother and Father was alive." All of Allison's and my misfortunes seemed to come at once. "He was the dearest man you ever saw," Allison added. "Some people thought him queer, but you never minded his peculiar ways after you knew him. Uncle Josiah was very good to us. He always told me that he'd back me in a singing career." "Yes," Grace added. "Uncle Josiah used to say Allison sang as sweetly as a bird, and he wanted to pay her for lessons with a famous teacher. But after he went to live with the Tophams, he never said any more about it." "He never liked it with the Tophams, though," Allison declared. "They were not kind to him, and he used to slip away to visit us." "Uncle Josiah often said that we seemed like his own children," Grace spoke up. "He brought us many gifts, but we loved him for himself and not his money. I remember, though, the very last day we saw him alive, he told us, 'I have planned a very big surprise to make you girls happy, but I can't tell you what it is now. You'll see it in my will.' Those were his last words." "And then the Tophams got everything," Allison said. "He must have changed his mind for some reason." "It's hard to believe he would forget his promise to us," Grace said sadly. "Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if a later will could be found?" Allison exclaimed. "Yes," Nancy said slowly. "I've heard that Mr. Crowley told other people that he was leaving money to them. The Turner sisters, for instance. Do you know them?" "Slightly," Grace answered. "My dad," Nancy went on, is a lawyer, and he and I are very much interested in this case. He even mentioned you girls, and to tell the truth, I was on my way here to talk to you." Allison impulsively grabbed Nancy's arm. "You say your father was a lawyer?" "Grace and I are positive Uncle Josiah made a later will. Oh, if we could only engage your father to help us prove this." Then a sad look came over her face. "But I'm forgetting. We wouldn't have any money to pay him if we should lose the case." "Don't let that worry you," said Nancy kindly. "This is your birthday, and you must be happy, Allison. My special wish for you is that before you're 1 year older, you'll inherit some of the Crowley money so that you can take those singing lessons." Chapter 6. An Exciting Appointment. The Hoover girls walked out to the barn with Nancy. "Do come see us again," Grace called as the young detective climbed into her car. "Yes, please do," Allison added. Nancy promised that she would. "As soon as I have some news," she said. Although the weather had cleared, the river road remained muddy and slippery. Nancy found it necessary to drive with extreme care for the next 2 miles until she reached the main highway. "No wonder the river road isn't used much," she thought. "And how do Grace and Allison get to town?" Nancy wondered. She had not seen a car at the Hoover house, and she knew that no bus passed their door. "I certainly wish," she thought, "that I or someone else could locate a later will of Josiah Crowley's by which the Hoovers and the Turners would receive some much-needed money. I must tell Dad about this latest development." She decided to see if her father was in his office, and drove directly there. Nancy parked the car in a nearby lot. She surveyed the convertible ruefully as she climbed out. Poor thing, it certainly needs a bath. Nancy found Mr. Drew in. As she entered his private office, he arose from the desk chair to kiss her. "Oh, I'm glad you're here, and safe," the lawyer said. "I was worried about you when the violent storm came up. When Hannah phoned me that you weren't back, I began to regret I'd sent you on the errand." His daughter grinned. "I'm back, all in one piece. I delivered the papers to Judge Hart, and learned that he and his wife saw Mr. Crowley in Masonville a couple of times. Also, I talked to the Hoover girls." She described her meeting with Allison and Grace Hoover, and ended by asking her father if he could help them. "From what you say, it does look as though Josiah Crowley might have made another will which included them as beneficiaries," Mr. Drew commented thoughtfully. "I'll be glad to do anything I can to help the Hoover girls." He asked whether the sisters had given Nancy any specific information about Mr. Crowley's habits or other helpful clues. When Nancy shook her head, Mr. Drew suggested that she invite the girls to his office for a little conference. "Perhaps if I ask them questions, it will help recall helpful incidents." The lawyer studied his desk calendar for a moment and then looked up at his daughter. "How about tomorrow afternoon at 2:45? I can give them about half an hour." For an answer, Nancy gave her father a hug and then asked if she might use his telephone to call the Hoovers at once. Grace and Allison eagerly accepted the Drews' invitation, and Nancy said she would drive out to bring them up to the conference and take them home afterwards. "Oh, you're a doll!" cried Allison, who had answered the phone. "Nancy, I just know you're going to solve this mystery." Suddenly, an idea came to Nancy. She asked Allison how long the girls would be able to stay in River Heights. "Oh, as long as you need us," Allison replied. "Oh, good! Then I'd like you both to stay and have supper with us," Nancy said. "Sorry, I can't join you," Mr. Drew told his daughter as she hung up. "I have a dinner engagement and the conference in the evening." Just then, the mayor of River Heights was shown into the lawyer's office, and Nancy arose to leave. She spoke to the mayor for a moment, then said, "See you later, Dad." Before Nancy returned home, she stopped at an old-fashioned house on a side street. It was the home of Signor Mascagni, a famous voice teacher who had retired to the small city the year before, but took a few outstanding pupils. Nancy introduced herself to the white, bushy-haired, florid-faced man, then said, "Signor Mascagni, would you be willing to listen to the voice of a friend of mine, and give your honest opinion as to whether or not she might become a great singer? If she might and could obtain the money for lessons, would you be able to take her on as a pupil?" Signor Mascagni studied Nancy for several minutes before replying. Finally he said, "You do not look like the kind of girl who would come here on a foolish errand. Ordinarily I do not accept beginners, but in this case I would be willing to hear your friend sing." He laughed. "Mind you, I will give you nothing but the truth, and if your friend does not measure up, I hope your feelings will not be hurt too deeply." Nancy laughed too. "I like honesty," she said. "As a matter of fact, this girl knows nothing about what I'm asking you. Coming here will be a complete surprise to her. I'm probably no judge of voices, but I think she's a natural. However, we will both appreciate having your opinion and will certainly abide by it." She arranged for a meeting the following afternoon at 4 o'clock, and left Signor Mascagni's house in an excited mood. "Maybe I'm going out on a limb," Nancy mused, "but this is another one of those hunches of mine that Dad talks about, and I must carry through." When she picked up the Hoovers the following day, Nancy did not mention the appointment with the voice teacher. The three girls went directly to Mr. Drew's office, and at once he began to quiz Grace and Allison about Mr. Crowley. "I understand that he was a rather eccentric man," the lawyer began. "Suppose you tell me everything you can remember about what Josiah Crowley did and what he said, which would help us figure out where he might have secreted a later will." "Uncle Josiah was rather absent-minded," Grace spoke up. "I often saw him hunting for his spectacles, which he had pushed up on his head." "Did he ever hide things?" Mr. Drew asked. "Oh, yes," Allison laughed. "Uncle Josiah was always putting articles away in what he called a safe place, but the places were so safe that he could never find the things again." "Then," Nancy spoke up excitedly, "Mr. Crowley could have hidden a will and then forgotten where?" "I suppose so," Grace replied. "While living with the Tophams, I'm sure that's just what he would have done. One day when he was calling at our house, he talked about how the Tophams and the way that they were trying to get all of his money. I guess they think just because I stay on that they're going to get everything. But they'll be fooled when they find I've made another will," he said with that odd little chuckle of his. "This time I'm not going to trust it to any lawyer. I'll put it away in a place that I know will be safe." Allison asked Mr. Drew, "Do you think Uncle Josiah hid another will somewhere in the Topham's house?" The lawyer looked down at his desk for several seconds before replying. "If he did, we would have a great fight on our hands, I'm afraid, trying to persuade the Tophams to let us make a search." Another thought that had come to Nancy, and she shuddered at the idea. Perhaps the Tophams had been alerted by all the talk of a later will, had searched for it, discovered one, and by now destroyed it. She flashed her father a questioning look and got the impression that he had the same thought. But there was no point in discouraging the Hoover girls by telling them this. Mr. Drew continued to question the sisters until 3:30, and then he said he had another appointment. He would do all he could to help the girls and would not charge them for his services, unless they bring results, he added with a smile. "You're very kind, just like your daughter," said Grace as she rose and shook hands with the lawyer. "You have no idea how much Alice and I appreciate what you're doing for us." When the three girls reached Nancy's car, she told the sisters she wanted them to meet someone special in town, and drove directly to Signor Mascagni's house. As they went up the front porch, they could hear the sounds of a soprano's voice singing an aria from Tosca. "How beautiful!" Allison exclaimed softly. The girls were admitted by a maid and asked to wait in a small room while Signor Mascagni's pupil finished her lesson. Puzzled, Allison waited for Nancy to explain. "I have a surprise for you," Nancy said with a grin. "Signor Mascagni has promised to listen to your voice. If you pass the test, he'll consider taking you on as a pupil. That is, after we find the money for voice lessons." Allison was too dumbfounded to speak. But Grace cried out, "Oh, Nancy, what are you going to do next? We've known you for only 24 hours, and you have boosted our morale sky high." At this moment, the door to the studio opened. The young soprano came out, followed by Signor Mascagni. He said goodbye to his pupil, then invited the three callers into his studio. Nancy quickly introduced the Hoover sisters. "And you are the singer," the man said, almost at once addressing Allison. "I can tell from your speaking voice." Apparently, the teacher sensed that Allison had been taken by surprise and was a little nervous. Accordingly, he began to talk on other subjects than music. He showed the girls several paintings in the room and pieces of statuary which had come from Italy. "I prize them highly," he said. "They are exquisite," Allison remarked. Signor Miscagni walked to a rear window and pointed out a lovely garden in the back of the house. Then, evidently satisfied that Allison was at ease, he led the way to the grand piano and sat down. "Now, what would you like to sing?" he asked Allison with a smile. "Please stand right here facing me." "Something very simple," she replied. "America the Beautiful?" The teacher nodded and asked her what key she would like to play it in, and then began to accompany her. Allison sang as though inspired. Her voice sounded even more beautiful than it had at the farmhouse, Nancy thought. When Allison finished the song, Signor Miscagni made no comment. Instead, he asked her to try a scale, then to sing single tones, jumping from octave to octave. "You have a very fine range, Miss Hoover," was his only comment. For half an hour he had Allison try short songs in various keys, and at one point joined with her in a duet. At last he turned around on the piano bench and faced Nancy and Grace. "I believe," he said slowly, "I believe that some day we shall know Allison Hoover as an operatic star." Before the girls could say anything, he jumped up and turned to shake Allison's hand fervently. By this time the full import of his words had dawned on the younger sister. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. "Bravissimo, bravissimo!" he exclaimed. "You sing, you cry, you smile, magnifico! You will also be a dramatic actress, splendida!" Nancy and Grace were nearly on the verge of tears also. They were so overwhelmed by the happy news. And suddenly the three girls became very serious, remembering that there was still the problem of money for lessons from this great man. They knew his fee per hour must be very high. Allison began to talk and poured out her whole story to the white-haired teacher. "But I know," she declared, with a brave smile, "that somehow I am going to get the money for the lessons, and I wouldn't want to take them from anybody else but you, Signor Miscagni. I'll come back to you just as soon as I can. Thank you very, very much. Please, girls, I'd like to leave now." As Allison rushed toward the front door, Signor Miscagni detained Nancy and Grace. "This Allison, she is wonderful!" he exclaimed. "I want to give her lessons to see that her training is correct." He threw up his hands in the air and shook his head. "But I cannot afford to give the lessons for free. Perhaps I could cut my price." "We'll find the money somehow, Signor," Nancy promised. Then she and Grace thanked the teacher and followed Allison outside. At the Drew home that evening there were mixed emotions on everyone's part. Hannah Gruen had taken a great fancy to the Hoover sisters, and the news of Allison's talent had thrilled her as well as the girls. Conversation at supper was gay and animated. Nancy and Mrs. Gruen drove the sisters to their farm, and on parting Nancy again promised to do all she could to help find a will from which the girls might possibly benefit. But figuring out how to do this became a problem that seemed insurmountable to Nancy. At breakfast the following day Mr. Drew suggested, "Nancy, perhaps if you'd give your mind a little rest from the Crowley matter, an inspiration about the case might come to you." His daughter smiled. "Good idea, Dad. I think I'll take a walk in the fresh air and clear the cobwebs from my brain." As soon as she finished eating, Nancy set out at a brisk pace. She headed for River Heights Attractive Park to view the display of roses, which was always very beautiful. She had gone only a short distance along one of the paths when she caught sight of Isabel and Ada Topham seated on a bench not far ahead. "Oh, they're the last people in the world that I want to see right now," Nancy thought. "They'll probably say something mean to me, and then I'll lose my temper. When I think of how Grace and Allison and the Turners could use just 1/10 of the Crowley money, which the Tophams are going to inherit, I could just burst." Nancy had paused, wondering whether she should turn back. "No," she told herself. "I'll go on to see the roses. I'll take that path along the back of the Tophams, and they won't even notice me." Nancy made her way along quietly with no intention of eavesdropping on the two girls. But suddenly the two words of their conversation came to her ears, bringing Nancy to an involuntary halt. She had distinctly heard Isabel say, "the will." In a flash Nancy's detective instincts were aroused, and her heart pounded excitedly. "It must be Josiah Crowley's will that they're talking about," she reasoned. That's the end of the chapter. So I do have a photo to show you from the last page. Signor Miscagni shook Allison's hand fervently. So the next chapter is chapter 7, the angry dog, but I won't be doing that one until next video.